This is a Rattle and Hum Sports Podcast for Wednesday, April 24th, 2013. We are 24 hours away from the NFL Draft now, and with us covering the NFL Draft and specifically the Dallas Cowboys and what they may do in that draft is Matthew Postins from Rattle and Hum Sports. How you doing, Matthew?
Fine, Brian. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks very much for being with us. I was out on the road today, and I saw your Twitter message, and it said something along the lines of being inside the head of Jerry Jones, which I have to tell you, being a longtime Cowboy fan, is one of the scariest places I can imagine being. But you seem to be willing to go there, so explain to me what you believe is going through Jerry Jones' mind right now, 24 hours before the NFL Draft.
Well, lots of draft scenarios, and that's what's going through the head of every general manager right now in the NFL. About this time before the draft begins, every big board is locked down. Everybody in the organization has had their say. They've lobbied for who they believe they should be taken in the draft. And the general manager has now disseminated all this information, and now it's him and his top lieutenants, and they're talking about different scenarios. You know, what happens if our number one target falls off the board before we can take him? What scenario would we, look for to trade up? What scenario would we look for to trade down? That's basically what everybody's doing right now, is trying to figure out what the best scenario is going to be for them on draft day, so that when the pick comes down at number 18, or when the opportunity that you want comes your way, wherever you're in the draft, you can make your decision, make it quick. You've already worked it out. You've already assessed the risk and the reward, and you can just make the decision. So that's probably where the Cowboys are right now. They're making their final preparations in terms of what scenarios, we want to see or hope to see in this draft, so they can get the player that they want.
All right, and you also have a column on Rattle and Hum Sports right now that talks about the perfect draft scenario for the Dallas Cowboys. Give us a kind of a rundown of what that looks like.
Well, from my perspective, I think the perfect draft allows them to address the needs that they really need to address in this draft, which means offensive line, defensive line, and safety. I've got them taking an offensive lineman in the first round and the third round. In fact, I think it's a very interesting combination because it keeps together a couple of linemen who had great careers in college. I've got them taking a couple of defensive linemen. One's an end, one's a tackle. I've got them taking a safety, and I've got them taking a wide receiver. And I looked at it from the standpoint of need-based. And when you do a lot of these mock drafts, you're really kind of thinking about what the team needs as opposed to what the team might necessarily have ranked on their big board. But to me, the Cowboys have to address their offensive line issues. They have to get better up front. They have to add depth to their defensive line, both inside and outside. And they have to find a safety that can address the needs that they have in the cover two that they're implementing under Monty Kiffin. So in my perfect draft, this is how they do it. They go out and draft a couple of offensive linemen, they draft a couple of defensive linemen, and they draft a safety. So to me, that's the perfect draft. Whether or not the Cowboys agree, we'll find out over the next few days.
Okay, and I know also as you have compiled draft information over the last few months, you have scoured the internet looking at all the different mock drafts that everyone is doing, and so that's given you a chance to get a bit of an overview. What right now looks like the consensus pick when you look at all these mock drafts, who would be the likely guy sitting there at number 18 if there are no crazy trades that take place, and that's always a possibility. Who do you see the Cowboys taking based on what you've put together as a consensus of these mock drafts?
Well, if you believe what you read in the mock drafts, the consensus is kind of boiled down to two players. One's Kenny Vaccaro, the safety out of Texas, and the other is Sheldon Richardson, the defensive tackle out of Missouri. Those two guys appear to be the two guys that most of the mock drafts are kind of centered on. And what's happened is that Chance Warmack is a guy who was really associated with that 18th pick for about a month or so. Well, because there are no real, sexy, glamorous quarterbacks and running backs and wide receivers in this draft from a talent standpoint like there were last year, the offensive linemen and the defensive linemen have really kind of moved up into the top 10, to where some mock drafts have 8 offensive and defensive linemen going in the top 10. In fact, I saw one mock draft today that had Chance Warmack going as high as number 8. I think he's the best player in terms of marrying value with need for the Cowboys in the first round. But if you believe the mock drafts, it's pretty doubtful he'll get to number 18. So if you're looking at players that are in the wheelhouse of that 18th pick, barring a trade, it looks like Richardson and Vaccaro are the two consensus guys. Sylvester Williams of North Carolina is in there as well. It's kind of a distant third. And one name that I just saw today in Peter King's mock draft that I found interesting, Jonathan Cyprien, the safety out of Florida International. He's a guy who's done a lot of rising over the last month. Some people consider him a first-round pick now. I think that's a bit of a reach for the Cowboys, frankly, at number 18. But if they were to trade back and decide to address safety that way, he'd be a guy who might be in their wheelhouse.
And it's been very well documented. You know how I feel. I'm going to go crazy if the Cowboys don't take an offensive lineman in the first round, because to me, that is the most glaring need of all the needs they have. Their offensive line was absolutely hideous all year last year. So it really bothers me to think that they could take a safety in the first round, considering just how terrible that offensive line performed last year.
Well, I think a lot of the Cowboys fans would agree with you. And personally, if I'm looking at it objectively, yeah, I think they could get the most improvement on their football team by going out and addressing the offensive line need. Now, what it really boils down to in the Cowboys' war room is, A, where do they have everybody ranked on their board? And B, who's there at number 18? You know, how big is the gap between, say, the top 5 offensive linemen and the next 5 offensive linemen in the draft? If it's a significant gap, and you feel like you're reaching by taking a guy like a Justin Pugh from Syracuse in the first round as opposed to the second round, then maybe you look at another position. You know, GMs make the statement all the time, they're drafting the best possible player. Well, really, in actuality, what they're trying to do is they're trying to marry need with value. And I'm sure that's what the Cowboys want to do Thursday night with that first-round pick. I think their preference would be to go with the offensive line, but if the value's not there, I could see them either trading down or taking a player like a Kenny Vaccaro that addresses a need, but not necessarily the need that I think everybody who follows the Cowboys would like to see them address.
All right, a general manager for the NFL, an unnamed general manager, told CBSSports.com's Mike Freeman yesterday that he thought that this was the worst draft in the past 10 years or longer. He says that there really are only about 13 to 15 players that are going to be picked in the first round that would be considered true first rounders, a fairly low number. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree that, you know, there aren't a lot of, you know, quote-unquote high-end talents in this draft. I think every year when we look at the NFL draft, we kind of get sucked in by the skill position guys. And last year was a big draft for skill position guys, especially at the quarterback position. This year it's completely different. You may not see a running back drafted in the first round of this draft, which is almost unheard of. You may only see 1 or 2 quarterbacks get drafted in the first round of this draft. When you look at the glamour positions, there's just not the high-end talent guys there. And that's why these offensive linemen and defensive linemen are really rising in the draft and why so many of them could be taken early. So, you know, I'm certainly no expert on scouting talent, but based on everything that I've read and the research that I've done, there may not be a lot of high-end talent in this draft, but there's a lot of talent in this draft. There are a lot of guys in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th round of this draft that could come into the league and be immediate starters if they get into the right situation. And if you're the Cowboys and you have needs to address like they have, and you've got 3 picks in the top 100, that gives you a real opportunity to help your football team in the first 2 days of the draft. You can find guys that can come in and start and contribute immediately, and that's what they need right now. So the fact that they've got a draft where call it the middle of the road talent, there's a lot of good talent out there. That bodes well for them from the standpoint of they should be able to find 2 or 3 guys that can help them immediately. But the high-end talent, it's probably not as good as it's been in recent years in terms of the high-end talent.
When you say high-end talent, the comment that was made sounds like a comment that most fans would make. You know, when they announced that Luke Joeckel is going to be the first player taken in the Thursday night NFL draft, you hear this. It's going to be a golf clap. There are no quarterbacks to speak of that are real high glamour guys. No high glamour wide receivers that look like they may go in the first round. There's no high glamour running backs. There are players, but is that what we're talking about here? Because it's not a sexy draft, so thus it's not a great draft talent-wise?
I think that's part of it, and I think one guy that will be applauding loudly if Luke Jekyll is the first overall pick is going to be Alex Smith, the quarterback in Kansas City. Every team drafts differently, and every fan base, wants different things. Teams in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, I think they have a deeper appreciation for players like that because they play that style of football. Fans in Dallas, LA, Atlanta, some other cities, I think they have more of an appreciation for skill position guys because they run higher octane offenses, they throw the ball around more. I think that's where some of this is coming from. Guys like Luke Jekyll and Eric Fisher and Chance Warmack, they're going to be legitimate pros. They're going to be legitimate pros for a long time. But, yeah, they're offensive linemen. They're defensive linemen. You're not going to necessarily go crazy about them when you hear their names on draft day. But 5 years down the road, if they project the way that people believe they will project, then they'll be all pros, Pro Bowlers, and they'll be helping teams win playoff games and perhaps championships.
Okay. Also, I was reading an article in ESPN, the magazine, this week that I found fascinating because it looked at the draft performances of all the teams in the NFL over, let's say, the last 5 to 10 years. And they rated Green Bay as the best in the draft room, and they talked about their strategy, which was they always addressed their offensive and defensive lines in the draft, and they almost always picked a quarterback in the draft. And you saw a number of these guys who maybe never, and this included the time when they had Brett Favre, who's a Hall of Famer, but they always drafted a quarterback, so they ended up with guys like Mark Brunell, they ended up with guys like Matt Hasselbeck, guys that maybe did not play for them. They drafted Aaron Rodgers in the first round, although they had Brett Favre, and they had guys like Matt Flynn. The philosophy being, we're always going to have a quality quarterback there because even if the guy doesn't play for us, we can use him to, perpetuate another trade possibly, turn it into several picks or another great player. What would you think about the Cowboys if a guy like Arkansas's Tyler Wilson was available, say in the 4th round? How would you feel about the Cowboys drafting a quarterback, and what do you think about that philosophy for the Cowboys?
Well, first of all, the philosophy I think is very sound because if you look at teams that win championships and teams that win playoff games consistently, they've got good, if not great, offensive and defensive lines. They have lines that can move the pile on offense, and they have lines that can rush the passer and get inside the line of scrimmage on defense. So the philosophy is very sound. As for drafting a quarterback for the Cowboys, I would not be opposed to them taking a quarterback in the 4th or 5th round. We've talked before about Tony Romo's new contract. It's really, in all honesty, a 5-year contract because the last 2 years of the contract are all base salary unless they renegotiate it. So in theory, you could release Tony Romo in 5 years and not take any kind of a cap hit at all. I believe that eventually they will renegotiate his deal because they'll need his current cap space. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, they leave his contract alone. Well, if you take a guy like Tyler Wilson this year in the 4th round, you're going to have him for 4 years. So you have 4 years to develop him. You have 4 years to watch him to see if he can become a legitimate NFL quarterback. And at the end of that 4 years, if he does, then you can sign him to an extension. You can release Tony Romo. You can take the small cap hit you'll take in the 5th year of his contract, and then you've got a ready-made succession plan. That's the one thing that killed the Cowboys when they lost Troy Aikman. They had no backup plan. The only quarterback they had on their roster the day Troy Aikman retired was Clint Sterner. They had no backup plan. If you're Jerry Jones, you can't get caught in that problem again. You have to draft somebody. You don't necessarily have to do it this year, but if you find a guy that you think over the course of 3 or 4 years could project and develop into somebody that could be an above-average quarterback, it's not a bad idea to take him. But I think you have to address the current needs in this team as much as addressing the future needs because Jerry Jones has made it clear he feels like there's still a window for this team to be a great team, to be a playoff team, perhaps a championship team, and frankly drafting a potential starter at quarterback for 3 or 4 years down the road really isn't going to help here right now.
And Stephen Jones today is quoted as saying there is a 50-50 chance that the Cowboys would actually draft at their slotted position, number 18. So, of course, that sends shivers up and down Cowboy fans' spines when you think about the idea of Jerry Jones possibly moving out of the 18th spot and moving down to acquire more picks, because we've seen what a disaster that can be when Jerry Jones has run the draft room. Based on his history, how would you feel about him moving down, knowing how much they need, how much this team needs? Would that be a good move? How comfortable would you feel about that?
Well, trading down helps you in two ways. Number one, it'll get you an extra pick, most likely a third-round pick, depending on who you're trading with. The other place where it helps you is depending upon where you move in the first round. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, they move down to the San Francisco pick, which is 31. They'll save, $1.2 million in bonus money and about $2 million in terms of the contract given to that player over the life of the contract. Another thing to consider is if you trade up and you get into the top 15, then you have to give that player a 5-year contract. If it's anywhere outside of the top 15, you only have to give them a 4-year contract. So that's another thing to consider if you're trading up or trading down. Jones does not have a great track record of using those extra picks. So you look back at the 2009 draft, there's nobody left from that draft on this team. Accumulating extra picks is always nice, but you have to know what to do with them. And the Cowboys, have a pretty checkered history in taking those lower draft picks and turning them into something. I mean, Jones has actually done a fairly decent job of finding talent in the first round. Well, in reality, that's really not that hard. Where he really struggles historically is finding talent in the middle of the draft, the
round
4th round,
two
the 5th
on,
round,
Matthew.
the 6th round.
Round 2 on, he has a hard time finding talent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
he does.
Anybody can pick a star in the first round. I can do that.
Absolutely, and that's great teams in this league are defined by what they can do with the picks in the middle rounds. The Patriots do very well. The Ravens do very well. The Packers do very well with them. The Cowboys have historically, under Jerry Jones, not done a very good job when he doesn't have a guy like a Jimmy Johnson or a Bill Parcells to lean on. So, I would almost rather see them move up, especially if they could put themselves in a position where they could draft a guy like a Chance Warmack or a Sheriff Floyd out of Florida. I realize that probably forces them to give up their 3rd-round pick, but I think a guy like Chance Warmack can step in immediately and help their running game, and I think they need that more than anything else going into this season.
Okay, there's another issue here. Other than when Jimmy was here and when Bill Parcells was here, and you had a very clear idea of the identity of the Cowboys. You knew with Jimmy, he wanted them young and fast. He wanted as much speed at every position as he could get. Parcells liked massive size, and he always liked guys from big-time college programs. He was not a guy that liked to go after guys from, FCS schools and that kind of thing. He was always a guy that liked to go with the big programs, the Michigans and the Alabamas, and he loved to have big guys. Beyond that, when Jerry has been unchecked by 2 strong head coaches, it's been a grab bag. No plan whatsoever. You had no idea what he was shooting for in terms of identity of a football team. How much influence do you think Jason Garrett as the head coach has, and do you think Jason Garrett has a plan and an identity model for this team that Jerry Jones is actually going to listen to and be influenced by?
Well, in terms of feedback, being involved in the process, I think that Jason Garrett is very involved in the process. I think all of the coaches are. Frankly, most NFL teams involve their coaches and their scouting staff in the process. Juxtapose that with what Ron Meyer said during the 30 for 30 Marino to Elway show a couple of nights ago on ESPN. He said he wasn't even involved in the process of drafting Tony Eason in that draft in 1983. Wow. He didn't even have a say, didn't even sit in scouting sessions. Coaches today, they're involved in everything from a scouting standpoint. Ultimately, Jerry Jones is the one who'll make the decision, but Garrett's heavily involved. Now, as to the identity of this team, I think that's still kind of evolving. I think what Jason Garrett wants is he wants a team that, on offense, is as balanced as possible. He talks about it all the time, even though this team is gotten out of whack in terms of balance the last 3 years. They've thrown the ball much more than they've run it. Some of that's a function of the offensive line. Some of that's a function of the fact that this team is behind in so many games or in so many close games where they have to throw the football. I think defensively is where this team really struggles to find an identity. They've obviously been in the 3-4, but even before they decided to move to the 4-3, I really felt as if they had a difficult time finding out what type of 3-4 defense they wanted to be when Parcells left. Parcells liked a more aggressive 3-4. Wade Phillips played a more passive 3-4. And I think Rob Ryan did things in the 3-4 that I really didn't think helped the Cowboys, beginning with playing DeMarcus Ware in coverage so often. So I think from a defensive standpoint, I think their identity is going to be completely, flipped this year with the 4-3. On offense, I think Garrett is getting there as far as the identity is concerned. But, so many things have happened over the offseason with Jerry Jones pulling the strings that I'm not sure necessarily if, Garrett had a really good idea in terms of the philosophy and direction of this team, if Jones would listen to him or not.
Well, it's going to be an interesting next 24 hours, no question about it. Tell us what we can look forward to as far as your work with Rattle and Hum Sports as we get ready for the draft.
Well, I feel like everything you need to get ready for the draft is up on the site right now, from our mock draft and our mock talk to the perfect draft story. Our breakdown of Jones's press conference on Monday's up there as well. In terms of draft coverage, we'll be all over it all night, Thursday night, tweeting and covering the draft, writing about the first-round pick, and, of course, throughout the week, Friday and Saturday, we'll be writing about those picks as well. I think it should be a very interesting draft. I think it's going to be almost like an NBA draft, where you see so many players and so many picks traded back and forth because, like we talked about earlier, there's not a lot of high-end talent, but there's a lot of talent in the first round. And I think you're going to see a lot of GMs trying to move around, trying to get a certain guy that they feel like is going to really help them. But in order to get that guy, they're going to have to move up or move down, find ways to get value out of the picks that they have. Remember, the Jets have 2 picks, the Rams have 2 picks, the Vikings have 2 picks. That will play a real factor in how things happen in the draft, especially the Jets with the 9 and the 13. I guarantee you there are going to be several teams in this draft in the bottom half that are going to want to move up into that 9th pick for the Jets. One of them could be the Cowboys if they have their eye on a guy like a Chance Warmack and they really feel as if he could do what they need him to do on the offensive line. If they really feel like he's the answer, the Cowboys might just make that move to move up into number 9.
All right, well, it's going to be a great time watching the NFL draft, and Matthew, I'm sure we're going to be talking and doing podcasts about the first round, the second round, and throughout this weekend, so get used to my voice because I'm sure you're going to get sick of hearing up from me by the time the weekend's over.
No problem, man.
All right. Hey, good talking to you, Matthew. Thank you very much. Matthew Postins, again, covering the Dallas Cowboys, and we'll be covering the NFL draft for you beginning on Thursday, so be sure and read his stuff on Rattle and Hum Sports. This is a Rattle and Hum Sports podcast. I'm Bryan Houston. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.